Do you want to master a character that can enable you to carry every single game and you'll climb all the way up the ranks? Well, this DPS is incredibly underrated, and it's Tracer. A lot of characters are getting the limelight right now, but Tracer is silently an insane carry. So we're going to break down the 5 tips and tricks that you need to incorporate and the mistakes that you might be making that is preventing you from getting any impact on Tracer. But press that subscribe button and let me know down below, what character do you want me to do next? And let's get right into it. Now, the first thing that we need to talk about is, why is Tracer so strong? What about Tracer makes her fundamentally different from other characters? And why is she one of the most picked characters right now at the highest level in the Overwatch League? The first thing is, Tracer can hypothetically never die. Because you have a recall and many blinks, unless you get one tapped out of nowhere, where a lot of that is avoidable, and we'll get to that later, you won't die, which means that you are a permanent threat and something that can always exist on the battlefield. And being alive allows you to occupy space, make plays, go for picks, and there's just so many benefits to being something that can hypothetically never die. On top of that, you can follow up team damage surgically. If any enemy is weak, if they get to 1 HP, most of the time, they're just going to get healed up very simply. But Tracer can be everywhere, and not only can she surgically go in and kill something, but she can get out all the same. And she has the flexibility to abandon plans and make new ones on a dime, while a lot of other characters in the same class of her as a dive character are far more linear and live or die only by their cooldowns without a lot of adaptation that can happen mid-plan. On top of that, Tracer has the unique capability to 1v1 literally every single DPS or support in the game. Because Tracer can dodge cooldowns and deal a large amount of damage, especially if you're within her effective range, skilled Tracer players will always have an advantage in a 1v1 isolation, and that means that players can't come and chase down a Tracer alone because they risk being turned on by that Tracer and losing, and any enemy that plays very sporadic or in isolated positions trying to gain a large amount of space on the map are prime targets for Tracer to capitalize on. Now, the last powerful thing about Tracer that you need to abuse, and it's very important to her overall power level, is that she can position anywhere she wants to be and can't be forced out. If she's on the flank, there's a lot of characters that if they are on the flank, they can be chased down by the enemy team. They can be sought out and they can be chased down and killed because they can't exist there if the enemy know they're there. But if Tracer is in a position on the flank, poking, dealing damage, being annoying, there is no character outside of another Tracer that can go and chase her down and force her to get off the flank. Tracer gets to control the engagement. She gets to control whether she lives or dies. She can win 1v1s, and she can surgically go in and get picks to follow up team damage. Sounds pretty freaking busted, right? Well, not quite, because Tracer is very hard to master. So let's talk about some of the ways that you should do that. First off, with blink and ability management. While you're definitely going to use your blinks to navigate the map, it's very important that you allow them to recharge before actually engaging the enemy. You need to understand that your abilities are going to be traded for damage and resources by the enemy. You want your blinks to be traded for you doing damage to a support, for instance, or baiting out a certain amount of their cooldowns, but at a better rate. Like, imagine if you could use one blink to get out an Ononate because you're doing a lot of damage to her, and then another blink to get out that sleep dart, and now you still have another blink to kill her and a recall. So Tracer exchanges resources at a much more efficient rate, and she can do it without risk of dying. And she can do this over and over again throughout a game, and many times, especially if the enemy is already low resources, they're not going to be able to trade properly, and the Tracer's going to get a ton of free value, and she's going to be able to keep going without being stopped. Now, there's several things that is very important here. The more mechanically competent you are and the more damage you deal per second among your engage, the more resources an enemy is going to have to use to stay alive, and the better the exchange of resources, your abilities for the opponent's abilities is. That means that, of course, your mechanical skill is very important, but on top of that, you want to make sure that you're engaging enemies with the maximum amount of advantages, the most amount of blinks possible, the most amount of resources, and doing the most amount of damage right off the bat. And many Tracers that I have VOD reviewed, and I've VOD reviewed a ton of Tracer players, they often will spend too many resources getting close to the target, so they don't have any resources to exchange and duel the target with. Now, the next thing that you need to understand about Tracer is that she is best at following up your team's pressure. Way too often, Tracer players will say that they have many people on them. They have 2 people, 3 people on them. There's too much focus on them, and they're stalling all these people's attention, and their team isn't doing anything, right? Well, this often happens because the Tracer is actually engaging far too soon. Your team needs to take the majority of the aggro. It's very important that the enemy team is already investing their attention and their cooldowns onto the rest of your team, primarily the tank, because if they're already investing this attention and their abilities, then suddenly more pressure out of nowhere that they have to shift towards is not only going to be hard for them to do, because some of them are already actively fighting someone, but many of them are already investing resources into the front line, and they're more likely to be split up because the fight has been progressing. So those are opportunities for you to capitalize on Tracer. Oftentimes, a Tracer will get into the proper position, they'll see an isolated Zen, and instead of waiting a little bit for their team to engage, they'll go in by themselves, they won't kill that Zen because 2 or 3 people will peel, they'll recall, and now they're completely out of the fight, and then their team engages. And guess what? Their team's not going to be able to finish off any of the weak damage that you did in the back line, and nothing's going to get done. And you get in this cycle where you're going in and your team's going in at different times and no one's doing anything, and then you have a Tracer that has no deaths but no impact. And this has happened far too often, and it's very important that you get this step right, because ultimately this is the best way in order to get guaranteed value, is wait to play off your team. And even if you don't have a great team, you can still use them and their pressure and their meat shields to better your own plays. You just got to note the timing of your engagement and time it just after your team has engaged. Now, the next thing that we need to talk about is matchups. And we did talk about how Tracer has an advantage in the majority of matchups, and she can actually win a true 1v1. But that doesn't mean there aren't certain DPS and supports that she has to be careful of, and specific cooldowns she has to be cognizant of. And we also got to talk about some of her matchups with tanks right now. Now, first off, let's talk about some of the DPS. Now, the most important thing about Tracer is that she wants to fight in her own effective range, which is very, very close to enemies. Not quite body to body, but pretty damn close. And there are a number of characters that operate from distance, and if you're fighting them in the open, you're not going to get any value. No Soldier, Hanzo, Widowmaker, even Sojourn. A lot of these characters, you need to use a combination of the terrain, your routing, and your pre- and post-fight positioning to make sure that you're in a proper effective range. Ideally, you want to set up before a fight is getting started so that you're going to be able to blink one time and be within that optimal range to the target that you're trying to fight. Because otherwise, if you're caught in the open, you're basically not playing into Tracer's strengths, and you're not going to be able to exchange damage at a rate that forces the enemy to respect you in any meaningful capacity. Now, of course, you're going to have to be very careful about things that can one-shot you. There's several things that can do that, getting headshot by Ashe or Widow or Hanzo. These are characters that you're going to have to properly play around, and if you're ever traveling through open space, it needs to be incredibly quick, giving them very little time to actually punish you, and typically you want to invest abilities to just transverse through the map and then wait and stand by until you get them again before you engage. Now, as far as supports are concerned, the main thing you got to worry about is primarily CC. Something like Sleep Dart is very annoying to deal with, and it can be something that just completely shuts you down and gets you killed. So it's an ability that you have to bait out just like anything else, and unless you have seen it or heard it, you need to assume that it's there, and that applies for any ability that you have to play around. Now, on top of that, supports also can pocket each other, which is very problematic for a Tracer because you're not going to be able to kill them even if you're hitting the majority of your shots if they are just sitting there pocketing each other. But oftentimes, just getting the other support to peel for one of the other supports means that you can leave that matchup and go focus on something else in the moment and still get value because you effectively just have 2 supports healing each other instead of the rest of the team. Now, last up, we do got to talk about tanks, and most of you might be thinking that Tracer can't do a ton against tanks, but she actually can do a whole lot, especially against many of the top tanks in the game. She actually exchanges her abilities better than 2 of the best characters right now that exchange their abilities at a phenomenal rate, D.Va and Zarya. She's a character that Zarya really can't do anything about. Sure, Zarya can maybe focus her, but Tracer can exchange her abilities at a much better rate. And if the Zarya is ever focusing on anything else, Tracer can come in and start bursting her in the head with a really easy path, not even hard shots at all. And you're going to force that Zarya to keep using her abilities, and eventually she's going to get caught out where she's weak. Tracer can put extra damage into her, pulse bomb her. And there's a lot of things that Tracer can do that can really heavily press a Zarya. And on top of that, a D.Va is a character that, sure, D.Va can interact with Tracer, peel for her, eat her pulse bomb, things like that. But Tracer can be one of those characters that can constantly farm off this D.Va, heavily punish her if she gets too aggressive, and basically overload D.Va's resources, because Tracer's doing so many things per second, has a very high APM, or actions per minute, that a D.Va over and over again will keep using resources to try to prevent the Tracer from getting value. But the thing is, unlike other characters that full commit, go all in, D.Va saves someone, and then the person that full committed died, Tracer can keep full committing over and over again, and she's not going to die for it. She can always just recall and get out safely. So it's a matchup that plays on a similar axis, but there are very few characters in the entire game that can even do anything to D.Va right now in the DPS category. And for these reasons, Tracer is phenomenal, especially as you improve your individual mechanical skill on the character and your target priority. Now, the last thing that we got to talk about is undoubtedly the Pulse Bomb. And Pulse Bomb is one of your best ways to just completely hard carry games. Pulse Bomb is an ultimate with a very high percentage uptime, which means that having more successful Pulse Bombs, an ultimate that's capable of easily securing picks with low investment, means that you're going to be able to carry a ton of fights. But the one problem is pulse bombs are not easy to use. Now, there's several little tricks that you can utilize depending on how an enemy is moving. The first thing and most easiest way to hit a pulse bomb is to simply blink in, stick it right to them, and recall away. Now, this does invest more resources than some of the other ways to pulse bomb enemies, because typically you're going to have to either blink in and then blink backwards, or blink in and recall, and it's not always the easiest shot because an enemy is looking right at you. Now, if an enemy is moving side to side, knowing how to properly 90-degree and pulse bomb means that the pulse is going to be easy, because them moving side to side, if you blink to the side of them, now they're moving forward and back, which is a much easier stick. On top of that, if enemies are reeling from you, or if enemies are doing something that you don't want to face them directly, right? Hanzos, a high noon, there's a lot of examples here, and you want to stick them in the back, 180 pulse bombing an enemy, this can also be great against the Reinhardt shield, for instance, can be a way that you get through that damage and do it in a way that sets you up to 180 pulse bomb, blink backwards, and then shoot them and focus them post pulse bomb. Can be a really deadly combo, but it requires you to properly practice your 90s and 180s on Tracer, which you really should be doing anyways, in addition to practicing your blink distance and your blink melees and your 180 melees and your 90-degree melees. I know there's a lot of things to practice on Tracer, but pulse bombs are the culmination of that, and then you can incorporate different types of blinks and blink sticks depending on the situation. Now, another thing about pulse bombs is that there are easy or difficult targets to stick. A Mercy flying through the air while you're midair, that's a really hard stick. But a freaking Orisa that's just sitting there, that's a pretty easy stick. But the Mercy is much higher upside the majority of the time, and the Orisa is not guaranteed value because she might just live. Now, one thing is, you should almost never try to pulse bomb something that still has armor, because it's going to eat a giant chunk of that whole damage to the point where it's probably not going to kill anything. If you are sticking a tank, you need to make sure that their armor is completely removed. That's very important. And of course, with characters like Zarya, you need to make sure that her bubbles are on cooldown. Now, with the new addition of Kiriko being added, there's also her that can just completely neutralize a pulse bomb. So there's a lot of cooldowns that you have to track. But remember, at the end of the day, you have the tools to bait out these cooldowns. So you can set yourself up for the optimal pulse bomb, and then all you got to do is hit it, which is easier said than done, but that's why we're practicing. Now, I really want you to understand the full potential of this character when you learn how to pulse bomb reliably, because pulse bomb literally lets you win a 1v1 matchup with a squishy instantly. You go in, you pulse bomb them, you move on to someone else. This allows you to get exponential value, and oftentimes that one pulse bomb kill will turn into two. Let's go back to that double support pocketing each other example. One support comes and peels for the other, you pulse one of them, and now the other one maybe took a little bit of damage, or they're completely isolated and use the rest of your kit to kill that person. You got 2 kills, 2 supports, and you win the fight. And now you get to go set up for the next fight. Tracer's an absolute monster when put in the right hands, so don't sleep on this character and get to grinding. But if you have any questions, let me know in the Discord because it's absolutely popping in there. And you can DM me directly if you want to get a VOD review. Smash that subscribe if you enjoyed the content, and I'll see you next time.